All right, thank you so much. Man, I don't think I could have done anywhere near as good of a job of introducing myself. So thank you so much for that. Yes, my name is Joe, and I'm an engineer out of Portland, Oregon. And I am going to talk today about accessibility in design systems. And before anybody kind of heads for the hills because they get scared by the term design system, I really want to make it clear that I'm using that as a big umbrella for everything front end. And a lot of what I've been hearing at this conference around decoupled architecture and working with front end is very closely related to this. So by no means, if you don't have a formal design system, is this not relevant. This is really relevant to anybody who's working on the front end. So let's just go ahead and hop right in. So the biggest impediment that I find to implementing accessible design out there is just a lack of understanding, valuing, and prioritizing accessibility. There's a lot of misunderstanding of what accessibility is. Even very recently, I just came across a developer tweeting about this. They were up at 1:10 in the morning. They couldn't sleep because they were just stressed out that they were told that they just don't need to think about accessibility because those few visually impaired users, it's just not worth the money investing in that small slice of users. There's a lot of misconceptions about accessibility. People think that accessibility is a second-tier concern. It's not a priority like functionality or getting content out the door. Accessibility is also often treated as something that we'll eventually get around to, which is kind of a polite way of saying we're not really going to do it. And unfortunately, there is still a lot of people out there who believe that accessibility is something that's targeted for a really small group of users. A small group of blind users, a small group of colorblind users. This is something that I really hear a lot of, and it's very unfortunate because it's not true. So I kind of want to do a little exercise here, and I'm wondering in this group, what percentage of your users do you think have accessibility concerns? And I'll go ahead and just kind of give a couple minutes here for people to hop in the chat and type out if they have some guesses of their user base that have accessibility concerns. I'm seeing like 15%, 20%, 25%, 60%. These are some really good guesses. I'm glad I'm not seeing like 2% on there. So I'm just going to run through a couple numbers here. This is definitely not an exhaustive list of accessibility concerns out there. But in the US, there is 1 in 125 people are legally blind. 1 in 54 children are currently diagnosed with some form of autism spectrum. 1 in 45 adults in the US have the most common form of tremors. 1 in 20 adults in the US have some form of cognitive disability. This includes Alzheimer's, dementia, conditions like that. 1 in 15 people have chronic vertigo and motion sickness, right? So maybe those really wild animations that we want to throw on the website, maybe that's not the best consideration. Color blindness, that's 1 in 12 men, roughly 10%, and 1 in 200 females. Dyslexia. 1 in 10 people have dyslexia in the US, although some people estimate that this may actually be as high as 1 in 5. Visual impairment. I fall into this category myself. I have glasses. Some form of visual impairment, that's about 1 in 5 adults in the US. As you can see, this is starting to add up quite a bit. We often think of accessibility in terms of just the user's physical ability, But the biggest impediment to getting on the internet is often an internet connection. About 50% of the US population, according to a study from Microsoft, don't have frequent access to broadband high-speed internet. And that is an access issue. If we build websites and software that have 100 megabyte bundles, that's going to be a big hurdle. And this last statistic that I'm going to throw on there, this is actually an extensive study that I've done myself, so you can definitely quote me on this. 100% of users dislike difficult, confusing UX. So really, the answer is that the ideal user is a myth. When we ask what percentage of our users have accessibility concerns, we assume that the rest of the users don't have any sort of accessibility concern. And that's just really not true. There is no monolithic group of users out there that have absolutely no concern that you don't have to think about how they are using your software. Approaching things from an accessibility viewpoint is realizing that we are trying to design for a very wide range of usabilities for every single user. And so accessible design is good design, right? It's not about designing for some niche group of 5% of people. It's about making the entirety of your design better. Accessible design is human-centric. It's not about blaming the user for misusing the software or the interface. It's about improving it so that those mistakes don't happen. Accessible design is ethical, right? We have a responsibility as engineers and developers and product owners to deliver something that's high quality and to deliver an experience that's equitable, right? We don't want to accidentally disclude anybody or unintentionally make services that we're creating unavailable to people. And accessible design it's effective and it's valuable. And I really want to drive home these points, right? Because I think there's so many really interesting examples of how the things that we frame as accessible for a small subset of users that might have very clearly delimited limited ability, that same improvement will make a better experience for all your users across the board. Color contrast is a great example of this. So color contrast is framed as something that is important for people with visual impairment, but there's lots of studies that show when it's harder to discern as text, it's just not as persuasive. So if we're building something like a marketing website where we're trying to sell something, our base of users, that 80% who may not fall within the definition of having visual impairment, we might be losing 5 to 10% of them on sales just because they hesitated half a moment on clicking that button because it was hard to read. Then they rethought buying it, right? And so, improving that is going to make the design more effective. And effective design is what creates return on investment, right? This is where the value comes in. Accessibility really does lead to more money and better quality products. I think another, just kind of harping back on the color contrast, I think all of us have smartphones and we've been outdoors where it's very bright and we got glare on our screens, and suddenly having really good black and white text makes a difference as to how easy it is to read your phone. That's another example of how, that aspect of accessibility is helping all users get a better experience. So this culture of accessibility, when a team understands really what is accessibility and why is it valuable, why are we doing it, and they prioritize it, that is the foundation, I believe, to really have to ensuring that the stuff you build is accessible. I believe in people. I think that if you empower them with the right knowledge and the right understanding that it's valuable and correct to do, they will start taking the steps to make sure that it happens. So let's move on kind of to the next part of my pyramid here. On top of culture, we have tools. Tools are the things that we use to make sure the things that we're building are better. that they match accessibility standards and they help us do this job of being accessible. There are a lot of really great talks out there on accessibility tools and a lot of great Medium resources. I'm not going to dive too deep into any of them specifically, but I'm going to just give like an overview of the field of the types and variations of tools that are out there. There's a lot of really, really great tools built right into browsers. Lighthouse audits have been in Chrome Inspector for a very long time. You can pull up a website and run an audit, and it'll give you an extensive list on the issues that you have on the website. And luckily, these are things that are being iterated on and built on all the time. They're getting better. Chrome recently did some great updates with their color picker. If you pick a font and you inspect its color, you actually get this great little info here about the color contrast ratio. You can see what class of standards it's meeting. We can see it's meeting AA and not AAA. And they even give you little guidelines on the color picker of where you could move the color so that it would meet those standards. That's really neat. There are also some really, really great Chrome plugins and emulators that let you experience what it's like for a user with limited ability to interact with the website. They will mimic color blindness. There's color blindness filters. I've seen ones that emulate ADD and cognitive issues by kind of flashing things on the screen or changing the screen. They have ones that emulate tremors by making the mouse shake. There's ones that emulate dyslexia by sometimes randomly moving letters around in words. So these are all kind of great tools to get a sense of what it's like to actually use the website as a user with limited abilities. There's also a lot of really great code analysis tools out there. These are things like Linter. Ally has some really great tools out there for testing websites. A lot of these things integrate into other tooling like Webpack and Bundler so that we can automate when we run this. These are really great tools for just checking that the bare basics of accessibility are there. So are we including alt tags? Do we have ARIA labels? Is the quality of our code good enough to have the basics of an accessible experience? Style guides are also something that I see a whole lot of accessibility material end up in. What style guides excel at is educating. They're a great place to document where and why and how accessibility choices were made around the UI. They're a really good place to give prescriptions of correct usage, to tell users what colors belong together, what elements should belong together, as well as restrictions, suggestions on what not to put together, what doesn't work well. And then another really big tool that we have in kind of our new modern front-end age of component libraries and React and all these great things are the design tokens and component libraries. And for people who aren't familiar with the term design tokens, I'm really talking about just variables that go into your front end. So your colors and your spacing, things like that. And as far as accessibility, I kind of see these fall into two camps. Design tokens and component libraries either offer guidance, they assist users of the library in correct choices, or they provide guide rails, right? They're actually preventing you from making a bad choice by using that library. A good example of a guidance out there is the US web design system, their color naming scheme. All of their colors, they come in a spectrum of color. So you have red 00 through red 90, same with gray or black. And they have what they call the magic numbering system. And if you take the difference between any two numbers colors, or two colors numbers, if that difference is greater than 40, you've met AA standard. And if it's greater than 70, you've met AAA standard. So I can use that system to tell you right away that yellow 20 will be AAA standard accessible on top of gray 90. but red 50 and gray 50, not going to work. So that's kind of a cool way to like help assist people in making good choices. Guide rails, this is more about how the components are built and what they're allowed to do. I think in this picture, you have a really great example of two button types. There's a dark black button with white text and a white button with black text. And those are your options. And they have been predetermined to be accessible, and users of these components cannot assign other colors to it. At least they should not be. Well, hold your horses for a second. Tools are limited. Can't rely on tools alone to create an accessible experience. None of the tools out there that I've ever come across will cover all aspects of accessibility. They're usually just testing for the bare minimum, the MVP of accessibility. There's definitely no like subjective analysis going on. Accessibility is about creating an experience for a user that lets them access the information functionality of a piece of software. Another robot or another piece of software is really bad at emulating and determining whether or not it was a good experience. It can be very, very hard to test user flows from a UX standpoint. And ultimately, these tools will suggest ways to improve, but they're just not going to replace human guidance towards sound choices in both design and engineering. So kind of moving on to the next part, right? We have this culture base of understanding, and now we have a bunch of tools that we can use that will help us. Let's talk a little bit about process, right? Process is the step-by-step things that we do to achieve a specific goal. And in the field of software development, there are a lot of processes that we have to achieve those things. There's a lot of technical process that has great opportunities to integrate accessibility. One example of this is version control systems, right? We're all using Git. We're all doing Git commits. We're all doing Git pushes. We're all doing merges. Each of those steps is an opportunity to add a hook where we can run an automated testing. We can use our tools and we can say, hey, if these tools tell us that we have an error, let's not move forward with the process at that point. Great example of this currently where I work, whenever I do a commit, their lint is fired and a TypeScript compile is fired. And it makes sure that my type definitions are correct and it lints it against accessibility standards. So if I forget to put an alt tag on an image, it'll let me know right away. It won't let me actually commit that to the code base. Another great technical process integration point would be CI/CD, pre-deployment. There's, depending on how you have set up your deployment process, there's a lot of great areas there where you can run automated testing and kind of get back feedback. Alongside with the technical process, there's also a lot of management process integration that can happen. Here are some questions I think that can help create strategies and approaches to make accessibility more involved and integrated into the management process. So who owns accessibility? Is that an engineer? Is that a product owner? Is it the whole team? How and what are expectations and goals set? How are tickets QA'd for accessibility? Is it an engineer's responsibility to determine if everything is good when they review the code, or is that reviewed by a product owner before a new deployment happens? How are accessibility best practices promoted and taught? These are all really valuable questions to ask. At the end of it, though, process is what's going to make your culture and your tools effective, right? Culture and tools are the things that you can do to make accessibility better. Process is the actual plan and implementation of making it happen. And this kind of leads to the last, final, very top of the peak of accessibility. This is kind of the gold standard, and I really wish that every team could get to the point of getting feedback from real live users. As I said earlier, robots are terrible people. Don't trust robots. That linter that's running is a really, really bad stand-in for an actual human being trying to use your website or software and giving you real feedback. Gather real user feedback from the world. I have some examples here, and I kid you not, I was on a very large project, multi-million-dollar project, and one of their steps before a deployment every 2 weeks is the project manager would call grandma, and grandma would hop on to the demo environment and do some usability testing. Mob testing among the team is a great way to do this. Real user data and feedback is even better, right? Like actually hearing from your users where they're at. And then I think the gold standard, the best that I've kind of seen out there, are full-on professional services. They're QA companies that actually have teams of users with limited abilities, and you can hire them out, and you have a real person with visual impairment or cognitive issues or whatever disability they might have. They're actually using your product, and they're going to give you real life feedback on where they're struggling. Don't let that be overwhelming. This can also be really simple. You're the first user of your work, so run yourself as your first user test, and just have your team work with an eye towards accessibility. I think we're just about at time, so I'm going to wrap it up so I can have some questions here. But that's my kind of strategic approach, mental model for ensuring accessibility is effectively implemented.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe. If there's any,
I will happily take some questions.
Yes, absolutely.
Here's a question from Matt. Do you have the name of those services with real users testing?
I don't off the top of my head, but a Google search for accessibility user testing should probably send you on the right path there.
Cool. Yeah, there are a couple out there if you Google it out there, and they are definitely much better than our robot overlords. And I'm saying robot overlords because you yelled at them, and I want to make sure that everything's cool.
It feels like
Joe just put in the chat usertesting.com. So there you go. Cool.